You may or may not know that this is actually the feast day of a new saint, St. Faustina. And it falls well this year with that gospel, blood and water. She was given the meaning of it. We have the washing and we have the nourishing. Washing completely from sin and nourishing with the blood that as a good pelican the Lord feeds us with. Our life, if we're Catholics, cannot but be Eucharistic. Hence the big question mark over the likes of modern means of getting Catholics back, e.g. the Alpha course. It's based essentially on an evangelical or Anglican mindset. It's starting from the wrong end. I'd like for a moment to pause on this central part of our faith, lest in the present current of events we forget certain central issues and get sucked into the periphery. It's all about Jesus. And it's in looking into his eyes, as actually the Gospel says, looking at the one that was pierced, that the rest comes into focus. If we actually get into mode of trying to adjust and fix the world, e.g. by spending hours on end listening to the latest bits of news, whatever might be the source, we're actually going to risk not helping the problem and damaging our souls in the process. It's not exactly the way it's healed. The Lord asks something other of the individual, that he should be in living relationship with him, focusing on him, and never allowing that to be obscured. Now I want to go into one or two things specifically. This is what we have in common with all those who have marched before us in the Catholic faith unto glory. As you may know, over the centuries, things evolved in a different way between East and West with regard to the way the Blessed Sacrament was on a daily basis handled. Fairly soon, as history goes, the unsolemn, the unsung celebration came into the West, which never happened in the East. And the result was that also the number of communions as time went on increased, and also the devotion to the physical centrality of the host evolved in a way that it never did in the East. If one goes to a church of the Eastern Rite, one can't even see the tabernacle. It's behind the holy doors. And adoration as we know it is virtually unknown. Also, in the celebration itself, they are unwilling to pinpoint the point at which the presence starts. The whole of the celebration is consecratory, and the Holy Spirit is too great to be pinned down in their mind, which is more mystical. Hence one finds that when it comes, for instance, to the grand entry, when the altar boy comes backwards before the Blessed Sacrament, not yet present actually, but before the holy gifts, he's incensing it, walking backwards, and as though the presence were there. But that's before the consecration. They do not understand our way of looking at things, that only at one point does it actually happen. I just leave that as it is, just to throw it out, to show that the way it developed was very different in the East, and that would explain quite a few things with regard to, e.g., the way that we now focus very much on the sacred host, but from a certain point onwards. And it's led to this huge development in the Catholic Church of Eucharistic adoration as we know it. And it's led also to whole convents, monasteries, and even congregations giving their life to adoring, in practice, that host. But there are also other ways of doing the same which are not unknown in our history and which we need to be aware of. Do you know that in the Middle Ages it was fairly easy to become a monk, but in quite a few areas it wasn't always quite so simple to become a nun as we know it, and one way around it was actually to do it oneself, to become a recluse, and that was protected by the bishop, who would enclose physically the nun next to the Blessed Sacrament. Eventually the discipline of reclusion came into convents with the double grille and so on, but it's an echo of reclusion. And the convents developed also in a very big way as time went on. But the other one also carried on for quite a long time in the Middle Ages, so that a village would often have her recluse. She was in this little cell at the same side of the church as the Blessed Sacrament, with a little grille open towards the tabernacle, that she would be gazing at, adoring, not exposed in those days, but just gazing at and keeping company to, as a lamp, a human candle always burning, just there keeping Jesus company. And these were pretty frequent in England, we know, in the Middle Ages. And I remember in formation in France how reading calmly about this style of life hugely put me on fire with regard to the beauty of that living sacrifice. What could be more glorious than just to be a lamp for Jesus until death, simplified, orientated in one direction? Well, something of that is also available to us. Why? Because through divine providence, adoration is available all through this land. When I got to Meath, now years ago, and went to see Bishop Smith, one of the first things he said to me was, "We have adoration in all the churches in this diocese." And he was pleased that was the case. And in quite a few places, it's a lot of it. Just think of Navan on that side and Drogheda on this side. There's a lot of nocturnal adoration going on. And also, since then, he's responsible for bringing the Benedictines of adoration up the road there, just outside our parish, linked with the nuns who are more numerous there in Holland. They have it all the time, and it's very beautiful to see these human lamps doing nothing but adoring and loving and singing the beauty of Jesus with their little voices. Now, this then is our heritage, and it's what we want to recuperate in this current wave of unease through bits of bad news breaking out. Because we can lose the plot, we can actually damage that part which the Lord actually really wants us to do. He wants us on the mystical level to make up for, and not always to get involved with many words. Words, words, words. What do words do? Through the word, our energy goes. Our energy, mental and physical, goes in a conversation, and we drain ourselves. And when it comes to adoration, we are elsewhere. We're thinking of what we've said and all the bad things we might have said. Whereas if we spend that time with Jesus, with the one who's in control, he wants reparation. And do you think he's not big enough to handle these issues? He is, after all, Lord of the church, and it's his church. And one thing which actually might help you in this current state of affairs is to distinguish theologically between the levels of competence. It is only within certain specific, narrow parameters that we are guaranteed infallibility. To presume too much is actually not to be helpful. Because if, for instance, even the successor of Peter says certain things, but outside those parameters which protect, then it is not protected in the same way by the Holy Spirit. That can actually help us to see the levels of importance with certain things being said here and there. They're very narrow, if one looks at it theologically, those parameters that do protect, with the seal of the Holy Spirit, infallibility. And by the way, it's important also to collocate any word coming from any person in the wider context of the whole teaching body and the whole history of the magisterium. One has no authority over that huge weight. It's bigger than us. Why? It's the whole teaching body of the church which cannot lie and cannot then contradict itself. It's important to collocate all within that total magisterium. Now, I want to go into just one example of the kind of thing that actually happens when a person does nothing else but that I started off with, only gazing at Jesus. Do you know that some of the greatest saints are totally unknown, or virtually, and will only be known at the last day? And many of the great saints of the Catholic Church were not bishops or even priests, but they were great lovers. I just want to cite one example of a very little known saint, but somebody who might have a lesson for us. It was a lay brother of the Franciscan order, but a very strict reform, the one that was made by St. Peter of Alcantara. He was a very severe mystic, and he appeared to St. Teresa of Avila after his death and said this: "O blessed penance that has earned such great a reward." Well, this lay brother, who died in 1592, was a certain Pascal Bailon. He served his community in various capacities and lovingly cared for the sick and poor. That we can do quite often on a daily basis. Care. Jesus served in the flesh of the person next to me. Remember the lesson of Teresa of Avila of Calcutta, that her nuns were to treat those poor people in the streets, their flesh, with the same respect as the priest treats the flesh of Jesus at the altar. So, his great love for the Blessed Sacrament earned him the title the Saint of the Eucharist. After his death, at the age of 52, many wonders took place, including, notice this, the miraculous sweat and the movement of his eyes toward the Blessed Sacrament. That's after his death. Both of which are mentioned in other chapters of this same work. So that's been discussed at greater length. It's a very puzzling one, that one, the eyes after the death. So, eventually, it came to trying to protect the body, and they put some kind of limestone on it, which actually would, if anything, accelerate the decomposition. Eventually, it was, because of his sanctity, opened up again, and it was completely fresh, and there was a livingness about the face, and those eyes were still bright, the eyes that did nothing but adore and love. Eventually they had to open it again much later in time, and this time there was a fragrance as well. And the report, years after his death, was in this word from the doctors themselves: "We, the undersigned doctors and surgeons, affirm on oath before God, and according to our conscience, that the body of the said brother Pascal Bailon is incorrupt, that the manner of its preservation is supernatural and miraculous. That, in spite of being twice covered with quicklime, which should destroy all the flesh." So he was canonized in 1690, and his extraordinary devotion to the Blessed Sacrament was rewarded by Pope Leo XIII in 1897, when he was made the patron of Eucharistic congresses. and all organizations dedicated to increasing love and devotion to the Holy Eucharist. I just go back to conclude with what I started off with. Compare that with the likes of the Alpha course. When I was a student, I was aware of what happens to young students getting to university campus for the first time. This I put in the context of what's going on right now in Rome with regard to the Synod for the Youth. It's not actually what quite a few pastors think that works with students. I'll give one example. We noticed that the Pentecostals and the Evangelicals were fairly keen on fishing souls, and they had ways and means of doing so. But we, as Catholics, had our own. It was gentler, and it was authentic, it worked. There were converts here and there who came in, but then I noticed there was eventually a change of chaplain, and things changed. He, obviously out of goodwill, and in the interest of being on side with the students and the youth, bent over backwards to get onto the level, discarded his collar, and did many things like them. And when it came to the beginning of term 1 year, when they get into freshers, those coming into university, he wanted to put on, and he was keen on doing it, a pub crawl, going from pub to pub and getting them on side from the beginning. And I remember, where did the backlash come from? But from the student body itself. And I remember one student, who by now was a Franciscan, going up to him and saying, "If you do that, I'll have nothing to do with it or with the Catholic Society. I'm warning you, chaplain, if you do this, you'll have exactly what the evangelicals over the road want. Scandal against the Catholic Church." So I put that out there because I remember listening to what the other students were saying. What they were looking for was not the latest gimmick at all. It was authenticity. And if they didn't find it in the Catholic Church, they went it apparently to LOS, where they found it perhaps stricter, but at least it was what they were looking for. They didn't want something watered down. So a little warning there. Don't think that it's necessarily bending over backwards to the youth that will attract them. If they're worth getting, they'll be got by Jesus himself, who has his own ways of attracting the youth.